you? This
We
is
are.
Yasin Kaya. I'm a member of Socialist Action in Canada, and I'm a public sector worker, and I studied political science as my PhD degree at York University, which is in Toronto. And today we will be talking about one of my most favorite topics, that is imperialism. And I will be speaking like 20 minutes. Then we have three wonderful guests here, which I will introduce in a bit. And this is another Socialist Action Canada webinar. In these difficult times, we're delivering two webinars a week on important topics such as eco-socialism, such as Marxist economy, so on and so forth. And as they usually occur on Wednesdays and Sundays. And luckily, after the webinars, they're on YouTube. If you missed any, you can always go to our channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Socialist Action Canada, and you can watch and listen the webinars, recorded webinars. Okay, so as I said, I will be speaking like 20 minutes on the question of imperialism. Then we have three speakers, commentator, discussants. First, Jeremiah from Vancouver, BC. And then we will have Emre. Emre is currently in Alberta, I believe. And then lastly, we will have Emily. And after the discussants, after they pose their questions and comments, we will have the first round of questions and comments from the audience, you. And just use the chat feature of the YouTube video, which is on our website, as well as you can go to our channel on Socialist Action Canada. But we prefer if you go to our socialistaction.ca website first, there will be the video available for you, waiting for you. So after the first round of questions, we will be answering those questions and responding to your comments. And hopefully we will have three rounds of questions. So if you missed the first round, that's fine. You will have other opportunities. Okay, if you're ready to go, let's get started. But let me repeat the website information: socialistaction.ca. .ca is the important part for the international audience, and don't write org or com there. It's .ca. All right, let's start with imperialism. So there will be three parts to my presentation. First, I will be talking about Lenin's theory of imperialism. And secondly, I will follow a historical approach, and I will talk about what was going on in the 60s and 70s. And as a response to changes in the political and economic spheres, and a dependency theory developed in Latin America. And this was a formulation of Lenin's theory of imperialism with its shortcomings. So I will be talking about that in the second part of my presentation. And in the third part, we will be focusing on the neoliberal phase of capitalism, the phase that we're in, or you can call it late capitalism, or any other name that you choose. And in that part, we will be together thinking about what is the new form of imperialism. So how, what kind of changes that imperialism go through in the last 30 years, and what is ahead of us. And can we still use the theory of imperialism formulated by Lenin? That will be the third part. And throughout the presentation, I will mention three topics, three points, which I hope to elaborate more in the discussion part. So if you have comments on these three issues, please feel free to use the chat feature. What are these topics? First of all, is Canadian state an imperialist state or not? So I will try to answer this question too, but if you have any comments about that, please go ahead and write it there. So that will be the first question. And secondly, what should the leftists, socialists, communists, revolutionary Marxists say about imperialist interventions in Middle East and elsewhere? In the case of Syria, should we support Assad? Or in the case of other countries which were the targets of imperialist assaults, should we support the dictators which are being victimized and attacked by the US imperialism? What should our positions be? So that's the second feature, second topic that I want to raised. And lastly, this is also another important point that I want to focus on. What about China? So for decades now, United States of America, U.S. imperialism establishes hegemony almost without the inter-imperialist rivalry. So is China emerging as a rival, a rival imperialist force against U.S. imperialism? So that's the third topic. Hopefully, we will elaborate more on that. Okay, so as I said, three parts. Lenin's theory of imperialism. Let's start with that. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Marxist economics, and we talked about Karl Marx's theory of surplus extraction, labor theory of value, and what exploitation is. So Marx has a very wide range of. He covered a wide range of topics throughout his career as a researcher and author. But two subjects left not fully developed. He focused on these here and there, but they did not have comprehensive analysis. What are these topics? First of all, exploitation in international level. And Marx provided a theory of exploitation in the labor process, in the circulation of capital, but he did not develop a very comprehensive theory of exploitation in the international sphere. And secondly, the theory of state. What's the role of state in capitalism? So these two questions became very important in the turn of the century, 20th century. And here's what was going on. First of all, in the turn of the century, in the late 20th century, late 19th century and early 20th century, giant firms, giant corporations were emerging, and these had monopoly power. And many authors, such as Hilferding, formulated the importance of these rising giant firms. And of course, we can explain this empirical phenomena with the Marxian theory of concentration and centralization of capital. Karl Marx and later Rosa Luxemburg, they all formulated the tendency in capital to centralize and concentrate as almost like a natural outcome of the competitive dimension of capitalism. So, in the turn of that century, we saw centralization and concentration substituting the competitive dynamic of capitalism. And these giant monopoly firms were an expression of that. And not only that, there was another development which is key, and it's the connection of nation states and firms. So these giant firms were also developing very strong ties with their own nation states. So German corporations with the German nation states, the ones in Britain with the British states, so on and so forth. So, and these corporations, these giant monopolies, in competition with each other, in rivalry each other, they mobilized their nation states too. And these nation states who had the monopoly of arms, military apparatus in their countries, were competing with each other, and the outcome of this rivalry was the First World War. So the competition was being escalated to the international level, if you like, and the competition was not only among the firms, it was also among the nation states with huge military apparatus. And these nation states were trying to capture new resources and populations elsewhere. So this rivalry of nation states and firms were for finding new resources, resources as well as new populations. So I'm not sure if you experienced the connectivity problem, but in my slide I experienced the problem. So I will repeat the last point just to make sure that everybody got what I just said. What I was saying is these firms who mobilized their nation states were in the competition to a kind of a race to find more resources and populations, labor power across the planet. And another key element in Lenin's theory was the phenomenon of export of capital. So export of capital was a response that the firms found to concentration and centralization of their capital. So when you have, you know, when you accumulate, and accumulate, in order to realize the accumulated capital, you have to use it. And if you cannot realize the capital, it's worthless. And so since there was over accumulation at home in domestic economies, meaning having too much capacity to produce, too much machinery, or limited markets to use this productive capacity, these nation states were looking for uh, other markets where they could export their capital, and that was a key element in Lenin's theory of imperialism, a phenomenon that he observed. Labor aristocracy, another phenomenon that Lenin observed and which was key in his theory of the imperialism. Lenin observed wage differentials across different countries. Today, it's very clear to our eyes. The countries in the domestic wages in periphery countries, less developed countries, are significantly lower than the wages, domestic wages in developed countries. And Lenin used the concept labor aristocracy to explain, to analyze the domestic workers with relatively higher wages in poor countries and how they developed different organization and kind of relative a kind of stagnant political activism, actually political passivity in core countries. And he analyzed the trade unionism in the core countries by using this labor aristocracy notion. So key here is the changes in the international division of labor, the wage differentials between the workers in the core and in the periphery countries, in the developed north and the underdeveloped south, was creating different characteristics of working class across the world, which is very important for Marxists who strive for an international solidarity of working class across the world. And international hierarchy of nation states. I use the phrases core and periphery, so which is key in Lenin's theory of imperialism. Nation states were not in the same leveling. They were, they were ordered hierarchically, and among the core countries there was a contest for global hegemony. So, and in the later phases of the 20th century, this we will see a development of a clear hegemon that is the United States. Okay, so that was Lenin's analysis of imperialism and his theory. And if you forget about everything what I just said, just remember one thing. The competition in capitalism, in the monopoly phase of capitalism, was being escalated from the domestic sphere to international one. Okay, so the competition among the firms in the international level, and firms were being backed by the nation states who have military apparatus, was driving the world towards giant wars, very violent wars. What happened in the 60s? That's important. In the 1960s, what we observed was anti-imperialist struggles, national independence movements, and the emergence of Cold War. Obviously, in the context of Cold War, the Western academia, aka the bourgeois science, was trying to explain or legitimize capitalism by saying that The underdeveloped countries in the south will follow the footsteps of the more developed countries. So Iran, Zambia, Turkey, they just in the earlier phases of capitalist development. For sure, they would say they will be like United States, Canada, Germany, so on and so forth. And Marxists, especially in the Latin America, developed a theory, dependency theory, refuting this analysis. They were saying, look, what you're talking about is just a myth, it's a lie. There is a structural inequality embedded in the international system of nation states. There are countries who are in the core that dominate the dependent countries in the periphery. So Zambia will never be like Canada, simply because it is being exploited. It has been exploited by the imperialist powers, and they were providing the historical accounts of how that dependent relationship developed, and the political analysis that derived from this analysis, this economic analysis, was twofold. First of all, they said, folks like Samir Amin, we should, these countries, dependent countries, the only way forward for them is delinking from the chain of dependency, just exiting the international capitalist relations. Okay? And the second political analysis that they said was, look, in Latin American domestic economies, there are at least two capitalist class factions. One is the parasite comprador bourgeoisie, which has tied interest to the imperialist core. So they're like parasites, they're like servants to the core imperialist countries and their capitalist class. That's comprador. There is also the national bourgeoisie, they would say, which has distinct interest from the international capital, and they have interest in protecting their borders, protecting the having more mercantilist politics, selling goods to their domestic market, folks in the domestic market, perhaps who would have some advantage from increasing wages domestically, so that the workers can buy back the things that nationalist bourgeoisie can provide. So the political analysis driving from this was the working class has common interests with the national bourgeoisie. So the national bourgeoisie should align with the working class and fight against imperialism along with its representatives in the domestic economy, which is the comprador bourgeoisie. So they were not support. They did not suggest the independent struggle of the working class. So that was the 1960s and 70s. Obviously, there was these analyses created, new analysis and political debate. But let me move to the third historical moment, which starts in the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, globally speaking, capitalism was entering into another profitability crisis, and neoliberal politics was the answer to overcome this that crisis. And what did we see in the last 40 years, 30, 40 years? First of all, globalization of production and financialization. So more than before, production, manufacturing, and other productive activities became more and more globalized, and obviously financial circuits expanded and deepened in global capitalism. So this was the neoliberal phase of capitalism. And perhaps more importantly, gone were the days of the uncontested hegemonic role of the United States in in the capitalist world. So new challenges are being posed against U.S. imperialism. It's still the hegemonic force, but yet this role as a hegemon is being contested. And more importantly, I mean, I find this very important. Ecological crisis. Unlike in the times of Lenin and in the 60s, 70s, everybody experiences the impact of the ecological crisis, and the world, the stakes are higher now. So imperialism, as it evolves, pushes the planet into a catastrophe. Then the question becomes, if imperialism cannot be fought, if imperialism wins, perhaps it can be the end of the planet as we know it. So the stakes are higher. That's a new phenomena that we should look at. So there is and the new developments, globalization of production, finance, the U.S. The role of the U.S. imperialism and its contested status triggered new Marxist analysis. I will just mention a couple of these so that we can get some insights from each. I'm not a hardliner when it comes to different approaches. Like some people would say, oh, hard and negri, they're BS. We should just throw everything to garbage since they just cut ties with the traditional Marxist theory. I would say that's not necessarily the case. Let's try to get whatever we can from these scholars. Okay, when I started my undergrad degree in 2002, these two people, Hart and Negri, were just rocking the social science sphere. And what they were saying was the space and the nation states are becoming irrelevant in the globalized world. Everything is flat now, or everything is the flow of capital from one country to another, and the importance of national borders are becoming more and more obsolete, unimportant, important. Obviously now, especially in the times of the Corona crisis, we see how nation states structures are important, and they react to crisis along with their national interests. So perhaps Hart and Negri's analysis of this flatness is not acceptable. But I think it is important to understand that capital has become more and more flexible in the last 30, 40 years. Flexible in the sense that it, penetrated into new spaces, new geographies, and in the already capitalist countries, it deepened its power. It developed new financial tools. It captures even periphery countries. Working class has savings tied to financial circuits, meaning their retirement savings are being invested in the stock market. So all these things created a new flexibility for capital. And York University, my professors Leo Panic and Sam Ginden, they developed a good theory of imperialism, saying U.S. all the nation states were very important, but there's the one unique, peculiar state that has a unique role in the international relations. That's the U.S. state. The U.S. state, according to them, has the capacity and the role to regulate the international economy. When it fails, the international economy fails, U.S. state takes responsibility and tries to avoid or fix the crisis. And look what happened after the stock markets around the world collapsed in last month. the quantitative easing policies of the U.S. state tried to, calm down these stock markets. But what Sam Ginden and Leo Panich did not necessarily look much was the economic sphere. So they focused on the political role of the U.S. state. So their analysis was a political one. But what about export of capital? What about the new capital flows? What is how can we analyze these and compare them with the previous characteristics of capital flows? And perhaps more importantly, if we have one super state, that is U.S. state, does this mean that we're seeing an end to the inter-imperialist rivalry? Will these inter-imperialist rivalries, which ended up with wars, a thing of the past, or will these will there be new centers of imperialism, and will we be seeing new rivalries and perhaps an end to which would perhaps end with a war. So I will let the other discussants speak now, but let me very quickly, in 1 minute, review what I just said. I'm focused on 3 historical periods: end of 19th century and early 2000, early 20th century, and looked at the developments in the international economy and summarized the key characteristics of Lenin's theory of imperialism. In the second part, I look at the developments in 60s and 70s and mentioned some key characteristics of the dependency theory and had a kind of a critical view towards that. And lastly, I looked at the neoliberal phase of capitalism and summarized the views of Harden, Negri, and Leo Panich, which I believe will shed light into our discussion. And hopefully in the discussion part, we will have more time to discuss about imperialist interventions. We will question whether Canada is an imperialist state or not, so on and so forth. So without further ado, I know I spoke more than 20 minutes. Jeremiah, forgive me, the stage is yours now. Thank you.
I thank you so much for that really exhaustive discussion, Yasin. So my name is Jeremiah, and I'm a provisionary member of Socialist Action here in Vancouver, also the Coast Salish territories. I'm an educator and also a master's student in education. And I'm also allied with the National Liberation Movement in the Philippines, and here in the diaspora, primarily advocating for Filipino workers' rights and other racialized populations here in the greater Vancouver area. So when I think of imperialism, the history of my country of birth comes to mind, not only because it is essentially my home, but also because of its long history of colonialism. From the Spanish Empire that ruled the Philippines for more than 300 years to its eventual surrender and sale to the Americans, as the United States starts establishing itself as an imperial power in the last decade of the 19th century. We also fell victim to the militarization of the Japanese Empire during the Second World War, which rendered our systems destroyed with the war efforts being focused in Europe. Just to give you a bit more context, Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, and with the exception of Warsaw and Poland, was actually the most damaged city during the war. In spite of our so-called independence from the United States in 1946, the country remains a semi-colonial and semi-feudal state, and it's very much connected with our discussion on imperialism. Now, let me explain those two components. It is still semi-colonial because while we may be an independent country on paper, we are colonized by a lot of these unfair international trade agreements, as Yasin put earlier, that put a higher value on the export of capital than the export of commodities. Thus, we cannot rely on the abundance of our natural resources to feed our nation and to establish prosperity. This has also led to our labor export policy, which is the reason why you see a lot of Filipino workers moving abroad to work and in order for them to be able to send money back to their families. A lot of these Filipinos become victims of exploitation. And we don't even have to look very far because here in Canada alone, Filipinos are exploited through a tiered system of immigration. Whereas labor export from imperialist and developed countries send expats, developing countries send temporary foreign workers that often get into contractual positions with no guarantee of citizenship or even being reunited with their families. Now, in the time of the pandemic, we see them suffer as frontline workers who unfortunately do not receive the financial remuneration and protection that they deserve. So what Yasin was talking about earlier about wage differential is not only happening in the global south, but also sort of like as the world becomes globalized, even within the borders of these developed countries. Now, I'm also saying that the Philippines is still semi-feudal because until now, with agriculture remaining a major industry, vast lands are owned by very few. In fact, more than 50% of the land is owned only by 1% of the families in the Philippines. These families, besides having vast wealth, also occupy significant positions in the country's government, thus avoiding true land reform and killing the hope of farmers to own the land they work on. Now, allow me to expand how we remain in this current state. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, in spite of our independence from the United States in 1946, they established military bases in the Philippines as strategic strongholds to continue their hold of power in the Asia Pacific region. As well, the United States, as what they do with other developing countries, remain to intervene in national elections to ensure that the ruling class will always work on their favor. In fact, just like in Latin America, the United supported the brutal Marcos regime that stole more than $10 billion, caused 3,000 deaths, and more than 35,000 documented tortures of the regime's political opponents. Now, why did the US support this regime? And that is, of course, to keep the country under the mighty hand of capitalism, with fear of communism initially spreading throughout in Southeast Asia during the 60s and 70s. Now, a few of these rich Filipino families continue to occupy the ruling bureaucrat capitalist class that govern the land and connive with foreign superpowers at the expense of the country's working class. It's interesting that Yasin was talking about China earlier, and we're going to answer that question because I feel like now we're in the middle of a struggle between these two imperialist powers, China and the United States. China has taken advantage of the Philippines' weak military protection by taking over resource-rich islands that actually belong to the Philippines' area of jurisdiction. So, in spite of a ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in the Netherlands that this was Philippine territory, the Chinese government has continued building settlements and extracting resources in connivance with the current fascist Rodrigo Duterte regime. Of course, the United States, in spite of its military-based presence in the Philippines and promise of protection, does not really intervene beyond words. And I'm thinking this is the tension that comes as there is the division of territory that happens within these new imperialist powers like China and Russia as they're establishing their power in the region. Now, while I focused my discussion in the Philippines, um, these very similar stories of poverty, oppression, and violence are happening in a lot of these developing countries in the world, all to feed the greed of the chosen few beneficiaries of imperialism and capitalism. So this just reemphasizes, I think, our role of as socialists to be internationalists as well, and that it is only through our international solidarity and toppling of capitalism that the working class can establish true democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Yasin, you're muted.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, Emre, it's your turn now. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? So
Yeah,
thank you to
sure.
everyone. My name is Emre. I'm currently in Edmonton, but I'm actually studying at the University of Toronto doing my master's in Middle East Studies. I just have mostly questions for Yasin and for everyone. The first one is a relatively simple one, and that's how do we differentiate and where can we draw the line between colonization and imperialism, and how did one develop into the other, and how are they connected? And the second question, one that you brought up before, Yasin, is our support for victims of imperialism that themselves we don't want to support, the Assad regime or Iran being another one. And it seems that Iran is both a victim of imperialism and yet a perpetrator of it as well, if you ask their neighbors in Iraq and Lebanon. And also in the case of Syria, where genuine grassroots movements were used as tools of Western imperialism. So on one hand, I want to support the FSA as a grassroots movement of Syrians looking for change in their country, and the other hand, it was quickly co-opted by Western imperialists as a tool against the Assad regime. So how do we balance our support for one movement without supporting imperialism on the other hand? So that's kind of where I'm stuck and something I want to discuss a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. Emily, are you still there?
I sure am.
Go ahead, please.
Laurier said music. So don't have quite the same credentials as the rest of these lovely folks, but here we are. So I want to first position myself as something of a child of imperialism, I think I could say. I am descended from a long line of British colonizers who've come to Canada, and I am aware of my positionality and the continuing benefits that I receive both materially and implicitly in day-to-day life, and how imperialism throughout generations has positively benefited my family. To that end, I am really interested in the idea of reparations as a concept and as a practice, and how the beneficiaries of imperialism, such as myself, might be able to utilize that positionality and the resources that we have at our disposal in order to decolonize and fight against imperialism while recognizing the ways in which people have benefited. I find it interesting that you asked the question, is Canada an imperialist state? And I think it is particularly interesting in this time with regard to the protests that have been happening in support of Indigenous sovereignty in light of the Wet'suwet'en blockades, and also the news, well, not the news, the facts that Canadian Bay Street is host to 80% of the world's mining corporations. So obviously we are a site of imperialism and we are agents of imperialism here in Canada. So I find it is interesting for us to reflect on, while also reflecting on how we are subservient in many ways and deferential to whatever the United States dictates that we do. So all that being said, and my positionality being stated, my question for the group to consider is, if the United States is a super state with an outsized impact on the global economy, what might it look like in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the economic and social devastation that they are currently experiencing? What are the risks to them as global superpower, and what are risks to the empire? And will this spread of disease affect how global capital flows?
Great. By the way, behind the scenes, we have Kurt, who is doing all the technical work, and he is doing an amazing job. He's the one who makes the magic happen. And Kurt, I know that we have several questions from the audience in the YouTube chat box. Could you please read some of them, and so that we can all try to respond to those?
Yeah, so our first question comes from Emily Ramsey. Are the US, China, and Russia examples of imperialist countries today? Our next question comes from Basil Falwell. If US retreat as main power, will we see rise of regional superpowers? Will they be able to dominate? And do you think that US dollar will continue to be the world currency? And then our final, well, it's a statement. Don't know if they want it to be posed as a question, but final question or statement for this round will be, so capitalism will eventually become imperialism, but imperialism is not necessarily evolved from capitalism.
Great. Let me start with Emre's question and then Emily's, and then I will try to answer the questions and comments that were raised in the chat box. And after I speak, obviously, we'll go back to our panel so that they can provide their comments if they would like to. Emre asked a great question about the relationship between colonialism and imperialism. Um, so in this presentation, with imperialism, I meant something very specific. So obviously, we can talk about imperial politics in the context of classical empires like Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire, so on and so forth. But the concept of imperialism that I use, which is developed by Lenin, refers to a particular phase of capitalism. So we cannot think of imperialism in Leninist sense outside of capitalist capitalism. So we're always talking about a stage in capitalist development, which came after the competitive era of capitalism. And perhaps prior to imperialist phase of capitalism, due to the competitive spirit in capitalism, we saw some improvements in the productive forces, and arguably capitalism brought some positive developments to the human race. But with the imperialist phase, that character was lost. I think I'm having difficulties. I lost sound. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's the difference between imperialism and imperial politics in classical sense. We're always thinking of imperialism in the sense of a phase in capitalism. Colonialism is not necessarily a capitalist strategic strategy. We can talk about colonialism in the absence of capitalism. In fact, colonialism served, helped the imperialist countries to, accumulate the necessary capital that they needed. Let me rephrase that. So, colonialism provided what some call a primary accumulation, so that all the wealth stolen from the colonized countries were transferred to the capitalist, to the core, the colonizer countries, which then accumulated and became a very important source for capitalist development. So colonialism is mostly interested in trade, and although some colonial powers invested in the colonized countries, the general pattern of colonialism was stealing resources from the colonized countries. Whereas in imperialism, the main dynamic is to export capital. This can take the form of foreign direct investment, going to a country and establishing plants there, or in more modern imperialist economic relations, think of Apple, internationalizing the labor process of a production of an iPhone. So perhaps it is being designed in California, but the different parts are being developed in the periphery. Another great question by Emre, and one of my favorite ones, the relationship between, or how should socialists respond to imperialist interventions against the countries which are ruled by dictators? I think the strategic, the key strategic role is to fight imperialism and oppose imperialist interventions, because that's the most dangerous beast. And this doesn't mean that we would approve the dictators and their crimes, but we know that the only progressive development in such countries can be developed by the people in those countries themselves. Only the Syrians can bring democracy in Syria, and imperialist interventions there would not be helpful in that sense. So as a strategic tactical choice, I think opposing the beast, the imperialist intervention is key there. and we should always look for progressive forces in such countries, the domestic progressive forces, and but we shouldn't have a kind of a very ambiguous positions, such as we're opposing imperialism and we're opposing Assad too. Well, in real politics, in real world, you have to focus your political line and make priorities in terms of your fight. And I think the top on the priority list is fighting imperialism. Is Canada imperialist countries? I strongly suggest reading the works of Yves Engel. So he is a friend of Socialist Action, and he writes on Canadian foreign policy, and to understand the how Canadian imperialist process, how the imperialist, to understand the imperialist characteristics of the Canadian state. His works are great, and as Emily said, I think one should focus on two aspects of Canadian imperialism. One is export of capital, especially in Latin America. The mining companies, exploit the resources there, which is a very typical imperialist economic model. And secondly, the military apparatus of the Canadian state, which allies with the U.S. military forces and helps them to dominate the world. I will accelerate a little, go a bit quicker. Is Russia, China, USA, are they examples of imperialist countries? USA, definitely. China, I think, finally transformed from degenerate working class worker state to a capitalist state. I think now it's a capitalist state fully, and it has imperialist ambitions. It invests in Africa, in other underdeveloped countries, and tries to get, tries to dominate there. But does it have the necessary military power and economic base to challenge the hegemonic force, which is the U.S. imperialism? I don't think they're yet there. The health of their economy is still tied to the health of the U.S. economy. And we will see this when the demand, domestic demand in U.S. drops, China suffers, or we know that the savings that the Chinese state makes as a result of productive activities, those savings are being mostly held in US dollars, and the fate of the US dollar has a huge impact on the Chinese economy. Hence, I don't think that China is in a position to rise up as an imperialist, as an alternative imperialist force against US. But that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. We should continue watching the new developments, because they can become one in the future. If US retreat as a main power, will we see rise of regional superpowers? Will they be able to dominate, perhaps? And do you think that US dollar will continue to be the world currency? I think I answered the first part of the question. At least I tried to. Will the US dollar will continue to be the world currency? The role of the dollar in the global finance is unique. The central banks, it's just the country's savings are held mostly in US dollars, and US is the only, the Treasury is the only country. US federal bank is the federal central bank is the only central bank which has the capacity to print US dollars. So we're talking about a currency which has a key role role in the international economy. Yet it is being controlled by one state, that's the US state. Hence, this creates an unevenness across the international economy. Will this change in the future? We'll see. Obviously not in the short term. John asked another question, and I will try to end with this. Explain large transnational corporation operating and controlled out of poorer countries. This is I think, very important discussion. because in some less developed countries, emerging economies like Brazil, India, Turkey, there are multinational corporations based there, which now has the capacity to compete in the international economy. I think this is a new feature in the new phase of imperialism, that is, in dependent countries, multinational corporations can emerge that may have even closer ties and interests in the global economy, but one shouldn't forget the fact that their own nation states have a key role in supporting these multinational corporations based in emerging economies. And obviously, this doesn't make Brazil an imperialist country, but Brazilian state now has a capacity to support some large corporations that has the capacity to compete internationally. Okay, I don't want to over-dominate the conversation, so let's go back to the panel. Perhaps they have things to add. So let's follow the same order. Jeremiah, will start with you, then Emre, then Emily, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a few comments about the question. So first of all, in terms of the difference between imperialism and colonialism, yeah, definitely there's a difference, and I think Yasin explained that quite well. And I think just talking about my discussion, I think the reason why I made that connection was because of almost a seeming continuity of sort of having foreign powers having power. So from actually extracting resources and occupying the land to, yes, being physically away from these places, but in a way controlling the economy through neoliberal economic policies, right? Trade agreements. And this is the reason why a lot of these countries in the global south are still suffering from a huge foreign debt, right? And sort of being in the sort of shorter end of the stick in a lot of these economic agreements. So I think that's sort of the connection. And it's almost in essence, we are still a very much even though we're independent countries, I think imperialism sort of is the new colonialism to a certain extent, at least in our perspective. In terms of supporting, how do states like Canada intervene in terms of victims of imperialism, right, and all these things. And I agree with Yasin too. I think sometimes the problem, I think, with the global south, with a lot of these conflicts, is that we're afraid that a lot of these countries, specifically the United States, right, which, as Yasin mentioned, it's very unique in that they have the capacity to regulate not only the international economy, but also, I think, international policy, is that whenever they intervene, there's always a fear that there will always be sort of these vested interests in mind. So again, I think it's really empowering folks from their own countries to be able to solve their problems. I don't have a quick solution for that, unfortunately, and that's something that we are still trying to all figure out. Yeah, I think those are my comments from the questions.
Short and sweet, great, thank you. Emre?
So thank you so much, Yasin, and you guys did a wonderful job answering those two questions of mine. Some comments I would like to make. I think when the first thing you hear when you think, or the first thing you think when you hear imperialism, is the sort of direct interventions that we have, like in Iraq and whatnot. And obviously, those are prime examples of imperialism. But I think it's important to remember the non-government entities that are involved, whether that be the IMF or even some UN organizations. I like to point everyone to read on the actions of Thomas Sankara and what he did when he took over Burkina Faso and trying to de-imperialize the country. And what that was actually trying to restructure all foreign loans, because those loans themselves structured the economy in such a way to dominate it by foreign corporations. So while Iraq is one example of imperialism, another is the IMF restructuring Lebanon's economy after their civil war. One is a much more direct way, one is much more indirect. One is from a government and one is from a non-government organization. So that might allow us to have a sort of clearer idea of what imperialism looks like today.
Great, thank you.
But yeah.
Emily?
Yeah, no, I think all fantastic discussion and great questions, everyone. Thank you so much. I think one of the things that is important to note about the United States, and one of the reasons that it is a particular challenge for us on the left and in resisting imperialist intervention, is just the stupendously outsized impact of the United States military and just the massive force that it is makes warfare as it was previously known virtually impossible, because it would have to have have a completely different shape just because of the superb outsized power of the United States, and that allows them to remain unchallenged in many ways. And so I think the United States imperialism will only be defeated from within. But obviously it is absolutely essential for us on the left and wherever we are in the world to stand against interventions and to force our countries not to be pressured by the United States through their various economic and military means to not aid and not join into those interventions, which are routinely failures at their stated missions.
Thank you very much. So, Kurt, we're back to you. Could you please read some of the questions from the audience?
Well, this will please Elizabeth because she wanted to insist that I ask her question, which I was going to. How are nationalism, imperialism, and industrialization related? I'm just gonna. Eleni already asked a question, so I'll just bump up Barry's question just in front of hers. In the current recession depression, profoundly deepened by the pandemic, what are the key transitional demands that socialists urge working class organizations to advance? And then we'll go back to Ellen's question. Is exporting ecological disaster a part of modern imperialism? And then we have Denken. Can we recognize Turkey as an imperialist nation today? And then I believe we should finish off all the questions we have in the chat. And Barry Wiseletter asks, for workers to benefit from crisis of system, workers need strong revolutionary organizations to advance our interests. A weak workers' movement would allow capital to make us pay for the crisis. And he ends that with A. So please answer.
Okay, I'll try my best. So one disadvantage of doing this from home is like my baby keeps crying there and distracting me. Perhaps she has something to say about these. Perhaps she's saying like, socialism or barbarism, something along those lines. Because if we do not, win the fight against imperialism, that's what we will have, barbarism. And I think she's trying to make that point in so many words. So let me try to answer Elizabeth's question. How are nationalism, imperialism, and industrialization related? I think I can answer that in 2 hours, but I'll try my best in 2 minutes. Nationalism and imperialism. So I think we can go back to Lenin's theory of monopoly capital. So what happened in the turn of the 20th century was that the firms, the monopoly firms, worked very closely with their own nation states. So German cartels, German trusts, working very closely with the German nation states to compete with the French cartels, French trusts, French monopoly capital. So, and that was escalated into the inter-imperialist rivalry and eventually a war. So imperialism, I think, is closely tied to nationalism because nationalism is the glue that holds the three elements: the working class, the capitalist class, and the nation state in a domestic sphere. In our example, the German working class had to be convinced that the fight against the French capital was the most important priority for them. But in fact, we know that the interest of the German working class was aligned with the French working class, not with the German state or the German capital. So in that sense, nationalism is an obstacle before our fight against imperialism. Nationalism is the glue that holds the working class and bourgeoisie or capitalist class that have alien, incompatible interests. So against nationalism, we should always support international solidarity of the working class. Industrialization, where does that fit in? Um, um, Industrialization, well, imperialism as a phase of capitalism came with thanks to industrialization, which meant higher concentration and centralization of capital. Industrialization allowed huge profits being accumulated in the core, and and that was a precondition for imperialism. And today, industrialization should be seen from the following perspective. The production, industrial production is now globalized. Um, if you think of computers or automobiles, different parts of all these commodities were being produced in different countries. Gone are the days where all the parts of a single product being produced in a single country. So then we have to see where the high value uh, components of an industrial production is being done. Well, I keep giving the same example, Apple iPhone. So there's several things in the process of producing this phone. The lowest cost, perhaps, lowest value added activity perhaps takes place in, as far as I know, in China, in a a sweatshop, sweatshop. I don't know what's the lowest cost activity, and maybe the attaching of screens to this phone. Anyway, so compare this with the branding or the design activity that is taking place in the United States. So more in the production of the of single product, more value, the higher value activities are being conducted in the imperialist core, and they're getting more, extracting more value from the process compared to dependent countries where lower cost activities are being this is a great question, but I have to stop here. But thank you very much, Elizabeth. So Ellen's question, because is exporting ecological disaster a part of modern imperialism? I think this is a great analysis. Exporting ecological disaster a part of modern imperialism. Well, uh, it's a great formulation. I think it is. I think it is. So. You know, we can see this from two perspectives. The capital, who are the winners of the current capitalist world? It's imperialist countries, and who are the losers in this imperialist world? It's those who are most affected by the catastrophic ecological disaster. Are the victims of ecological disaster, which happen to be the folks who live in less developed countries. So if capitalist relations of production is the force that is driving ecological disaster, surely the winners of this game are the imperialist countries, and the losers are the workers and the poor in the periphery, less developed countries. So I think Ellen's analysis, I would say it's an analysis, not a question, is a good one. Um, the, uh, the, uh, the negative consequences of modern imperialist relations are being pushed to the periphery countries. And Barry asked the question, I'll try to answer this as quickly as possible. In the current recession depression, profoundly deepened by the pandemic, what are the key transitional demands that socialists urge working class organizations to advance? I think a similar question was raised by Emily. Uh, um, what are the key transitional demands? First, so this pandemic showed us that uh, the world, the working classes around the world are, uh, uh, the economy is more globalized than ever. So it's very hard to isolate your economy um, from the rest of the world. And 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 we I think soon we will see that the capitalist classes and their nation states will come up with some coordinated responses to the health crisis and the following economic crisis. And we already saw some money being pumped into the international money markets by the United States and the other central banks around the world. And soon there will be an internationally coordinated response to covering the losses of big international companies and the banks. So capital is building its build its solidarity and will have a coordinated response to this crisis. Hence, the working class should do the same and have have a coordinated international coordinated response. And key transitional demands is one is internationalism, build international solidarity of the working class. Um, Healthcare should be free. If healthcare, if all had access to healthcare, uh, this perhaps the consequences of this pandemic would be less. And uh, let's think about healthcare not only as treatment but also as preventive care. And in the absence of preventive care, the disadvantaged segments of the society, poor and working poor, are being most impacted. Hence, once again, we see the importance of ability for everyone, especially the vulnerable populations, having access to free healthcare. And this is a key transitional demand that we need. And lastly, let's go back to Denge Khan's question. I think he was asking, can we recognize Turkey as an imperialist nation today? I don't think so. It may be led by a lunatic with imperialist ambitions, but at the end, there are some reality poses some challenges even to those who have detached thinking, um, even to those who are detached from reality. Um, in, actually, Turkey, like there, my background is Turkish, and this question was a bit more relevant like 5 years ago. Turkey, at least in the discursive level, was making arguments, imperialist arguments, um, and but soon it was realized that its economy is not strong enough to, compete with the other industrialized countries. In fact, when its economy is in crisis, this pandemic hit, which will deepen the economic crisis they're in. And secondly, um, its power, military power, was tested by Russia, another force in the region, and and to be honest with you, they just got afraid of Russia. So even their military base is not strong enough to compete with with, uh, with, uh, with the other imperialist countries. So I think to sum up, what we can do is like um, obviously the leaders of countries can have imperialist ambitions, but imperialism is a structural relationship. Uh, and if your economy is not strong, if you don't have the military that to back the imperialist policies, yours will be a imperialist dream, not imperialist reality. Okay, so I think Emre has a couple of points to add to this.
Very quickly, just not much to add, but and I completely agree. I 5 years ago the question was more relevant, especially under the Turkish foreign policy used to be ran under a man named Davutoğlu. He was Turkey's former prime minister, and he was a professor of foreign policy before. And he was actually trying to center Turkey as a regional imperialist power. But since his firing, it seems that Turkey's foreign policy has been led mostly by opportunism and really just the I don't know, the seemingly day-to-day ambitions of Erdogan. So today it seems less relevant than it was 5 years ago, despite the fact that it is in Syria today. I don't know if you would agree with that, Yasin.
Okay, I think you summarized it very well. We can have another panel on Turkey, but let's move on. Emily, can you? I think you would like to add a couple of points to ecological question.
Yes. Sorry, I'll turn my video on. Obviously, the global south is experiencing the sorry, I'll repeat myself. I think my connection fuzzed out for a second. But the ecological devastation that we are seeing is predominantly being felt in the global south, as we know, but also, again, with the export of capital and export of industry, a lot of imperialist nations are taking advantage of the global south in terms of what they are able to get away with. So obviously, in the manufacturing process and mining tailings and hazardous waste disposal and the protection of workers and the levels of emissions that are acceptable, the restrictions that are in place in Canada, for example, are not the same as the restrictions that are in place in China, in various sub-Saharan African countries where Canadian mining corporations have set up shop. So I was thinking when this question was asked about the dam burst that happened in Brazil a couple of years ago that was just absolutely devastating. And it was a known quantity that the company was skirting regulations and was avoiding taking necessary precautions, and as a result, hundreds of people died. So it is not only in the overall impacts of climate change, but it is in the day-to-day practices of corporations and these imperialist nations that support them where these impacts are being felt.
Great, thank you. Jeremiah?
I definitely agree with Emily on that. And I was about to mention that when you talk about, I think that's a fantastic question, and exporting ecological disasters as a component of imperialism, because one thing that comes to mind is the presence of a lot of these mining transnational companies, actually Canadian, a lot of them based in Toronto, that are continuously doing mining and extraction in the Philippines, which has also resulted in displacement of indigenous peoples there, and also some human rights violations as well, besides ecological disaster that it has caused. So it does complicate also the question earlier about, is Canada an imperialist country, and also like what are the blurred lines, I guess, between a Canadian transnational corporation or a transnational corporation based in Canada and sort of the role of the Canadian state, right, and how they are able to navigate and manage that. And I also have an additional comment about the key transitional pandemic demands for the working class. And I think it's also important to consider forced migration as a direct impact of poverty caused by imperialism. So I think it's fantastic that we're asking for healthcare and all of these things, but also remembering that there's that marginalized population that may be undocumented. So I think it's also an opportunity to interrogate the ideas of borders and citizenship and what that means for folks. So yeah.
Okay, great. So we're about to wrap up, but I think we have one last question. I will ask that question to the panel and ask for the panel's answers and I will wrap the discussion. Kurt, what's the last question? Could you please raise it for us?
Okay, the last question is from our comrade, Workers' Action Movement, and the question is, what kinds of contingency plans, preparedness, should a vulnerable country invest in order to combat destructive capitalism after a natural disaster takes place?
Well, great question. Who wants to answer this? Jeremiah, Emre, Emily. Who wants to go first?
I can take a stab at it.
Please do.
So disaster preparedness in the event of natural disaster was the question. So what I think a lot about this. I operate from a more eco-socialist framework. That's kind of my jam. There are a lot of things, but establishing strong communities in each location and establishing networks of mutual aid and solidarity, not stockpiling food, but having multiple streams of food access, so not relying completely on importing foods from one particular sector, having a robust local production of food, having a robust stockpile of food. There are many things, but the really, really key components, it really does come down to community strength and solidarity and multiple streams of recovery and actionability, not one reliance on one particular industry or source of goods and services.
Great, thank you. Emre or Jeremiah, would you like to add a couple of points to that? Do you have any concluding remarks, Emre and Jeremiah?
Just very quickly, I mentioned him before. As for things that you can do, I go back to Thomas Sankara and what he did in Burkina Faso. And just like Emily said, he increased local production, but he varied local production based on foods that naturally grow in the region. He reforested different parts of Burkina Faso that were starting to desertify. And he strengthened local communities, and he actually gave a lot of autonomy to those communities. And he allowed those communities themselves to take over their food production and decide what was best for them, they themselves knowing after centuries of farming what their communities could do. So I revert back to him as for how to answer these questions.
To add to that, I think Emre and Emily made fantastic points about how we're empowering communities. But I also like to discuss sort of the impact of, and I guess this could be a combination of both imperialism and colonialism in terms of the capacity and the ability of communities to be able to prepare for these disasters and help themselves. Just to give you an example, in the Philippines, in the island of, I think some are related, but during this big flood surge that happened, a lot of locals didn't really understand what that entailed. But because of, I guess, sort of the globalization of education, focusing on English as a medium of instruction, a lot of these indigenous knowledge, a lot of these things these disasters were actually talked about, and that there's already local knowledge on these disasters. So they've been encountered before through stories and narratives. So again, sort of decolonizing education as well is very important, and and more than anything is important, rely sort of the collective and the collective knowledge of local communities and their power.
Great. So let me end by making a couple of observations about the current state of imperialism and the stakes that we have. I believe imperialism is more aggressive than ever. And especially when you look at how imperialist core, uh, led by US imperialism, reacts to countries that challenge the dominant order, we can see this aggressive attitude. Even like in Latin America and even like social democratic uh, demands led by petty bourgeois nationalists are being crashed by military coups and force. Uh, that's one example to the imperialist aggression. What we don't observe and compared to the early 20th century is a violent form of inter-imperialist rivalry. So we don't observe a rivalry such as the one that took place between uh, France and Germany, French and German capital. What we observe is a kind of a suppressed inter-imperialist rivalry. It is contained. Why? Probably U.S. imperialism's military power is so much, or on the top of their agenda, they have the objective of containing Russia and China. So Japan, European Union, US, Canada, they're all allied to make sure that these perceived threats are being observed. But all this is happening in the context of an ecological disaster, ecological crisis, and if these imperialist uh, tensions are being are transferred into an inter-imperialist rivalry, which takes the form of a violent war, uh, and if this is coupled with ecological disaster, we're thinking of not only a world war, but an end to our planet. And what is the answer? Well, we have to look at the social classes that have interests that are distinct from imperialism, that are completely alien to the interests of imperialism, and obviously that's the working class. So, and the working class in itself will not solve the ecological crisis, economic crisis, health crisis. It needs to be organized, and we should start this struggle here at home in Canada or wherever you live in, and we should support the existing working class organizations, help them to become more democratic, and obviously we should build independent working class parties, which would include an anti-imperialist agenda. Imperialism is a huge topic. I think we covered most of it, but we cannot exhaust the discussion here. If you liked this discussion, I strongly suggest you going to our website, socialistactioncanada.ca. In fact, find the search menu there and type imperialism. You will find 16 pages of articles. Like there are so many articles that we wrote on imperialism, and I'm sure that you will find something very useful that would add to the discussion here. So stay safe, everyone. I think this was a great discussion. The video will be on YouTube. If you want to watch this again or send this video to your friends, please do so. And until next time, stay safe. Comradely greetings. Thank you.